All right, good morning. How we doing? Yes, it is still morning, if you can believe it. All right, we're going to kick things off with a quick word association exercise. I'm going to flash a phrase up on the screen, and when you see that phrase, I want you to shout out, unfiltered, shout it out. Shout out the first word that pops in your mind, all right? So what is the first word that comes to mind when you hear today's generations? Lazy. Well, that didn't take long. Boy, you had that one ready. What else? Unknown? Interesting. What else? Entitled. Everyone at once? Entitled, yeah. Innovative. I like that. You and I are going to be friends. Immediate gratification. Risky. Clueless. The best. All right. I think that's my CSUB students in the house, I think. Next to the best. All right, I think we covered all of them, right? Hopefully. Now, I have to be honest, I pulled a fast one on you, but don't beat yourself up. This happens every time I do this short, simple little exercise. And I didn't say anything about millennials, did I? I didn't say anything about Generation Z. But that, I think, at least all the responses I heard were geared towards the millennials. And I think why that happens every single time that I've done this exercise is that the most tension surrounds this generation. The most question marks surround the millennial generation. And so that's why I'm here today. That's why the theme of today is really the next generation of millennials. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Specifically, we're going to talk about next generation engagement, how you can truly engage and leverage this generation in your organizations, your community, on your teams. And I hope to have time for a couple questions. If we don't get there, my email is up on that slide, rj@ryan-jenkins.com. And then all of today's slides that you're about to see are going to be available at that link at the bottom of that slide, ryan-jenkins.com/KES. And I just checked right before I came up here, and my site has actually crashed for the second time ever. I like to think that's because my latest Instagram pic went viral just a few minutes ago. I'd like to think that. So hopefully by the end of today, it'll be back up in the next hour, and you guys can engage there. But just know you don't have to take pictures of these slides. Don't try to jot everything down. It's all going to be there for you for free, as long as the internet is turned on as well, which is an important thing. Okay, actually a couple of things before I go into the agenda, and that is, this is going to shock you. It shocks every audience I ever tell this to, but I think it's 100% true. And that is this: I don't want you to listen to anything that I say. You go, wait a minute, you're the guy with the mic and the clicker, the intro. Very true. Don't listen to what I say, listen to what you hear. I think those are drastic different things. And I think you can apply this methodology to any learning environment. Because we're all from different parts of the country at one point. We're all from different generations. We all have unique situations, diverse teams, diverse situations. So not all of this is going to fit neatly into a box. But there are going to be certain things today, 2 or 3 things I hope, that resonate with you in your unique situation. And there are going to be things that you resist as well. But those are all fertile ground for you to pinpoint and drive some depth into and start unpacking so you can move your organizations forward. Second thing I'll say, one of my favorite quotes is by Oliver Holmes, who said, "A mind once stretched never regains its original dimensions." A mind once stretched never regains its original dimensions. And so that's my goal. When you leave the session today, I want you thinking differently about the future. I want you thinking differently about the emerging generations. And so it's safe to say I'm going to put some stretch marks on your brain, okay? I hope you're okay with that. And the last thing before I move on, and that is this. If at any point during today's session, if you just see me fall on my face right in front of you and seem to be lifeless up here, don't panic. No need to panic. It's more than likely it's just because it's been over 30 minutes since I've texted or tweeted. So bear with me. Front row, just come up and rub a mobile device on me, and I'll be fine. Because I am a millennial. If you didn't gather that from my super swag and extra informal attire, I am a millennial. So bear with me. All right, let's jump into the content. Here's where we're going. We're going to talk about millennials. We're going to touch a little bit on Generation Z. And then we're going to talk about some of the generational differences that exist. And then I'm going to give you 4 elements, 4 examples, and 4 strategies to think about with your teams and organizations. All right, so here's a quick snapshot of the generations. Robin did a tremendous job on giving us some really good context, so we're just going to build upon what she shared. And you'll see in the middle there, this chart, and these generations are done by age. And again, the age, depending on what study you look at, they're all a little different. So it's important that we consider generations as clues and not boxes. All right? And in my opinion, they're big clues, very big clues, on how we sell, engage, lead, and communicate across generations. On the right side there, you'll see that's how large the US generations were at their peak. You'll notice a couple asterisks there in the bottom right. That's simply because these generations, unfortunately, aren't that large, just from folks passing away. So I want to give you a little context on why generations are so important today, and why it's such a relevant conversation. And I want to illustrate that by asking a question. So shout out the answer if you think you know it. What was the average life expectancy of humans in 1902? 42? 40? I don't hear a lot of 40s. 47? 48? 30? 38? Whoa, we're just losing a lot of confidence in the human race. 47 was the correct answer. That was the average life expectancy in 1902. Any guesses what it is today? 100. Now, okay, we got a lot of confidence. I love it. I'm hearing a lot of 70s, 60s, 70s, 85. You guys are, I like this. You guys have a lot of confidence. In 78, that's really close. In the US, it is 79 years old, is the current life expectancy. And to melt your minds even more, they now say that the first person to ever celebrate their 150th birthday has already been born today. Imagine what it looks like to have a midlife crisis at the age of 75. I can't even wrap my head around that. What does that look like? So here's why that's important. I'll give you some context. In over 100 years, we extended the life expectancy, at least in the US, about 32 years. It's pretty extraordinary. And so as medicine advances, as technology advances, we will be living longer. And so not only are we interacting with 5 generations in the workplace, but it's very possible, very feasible that in the very near future, we'll be interacting with 6, 7, 8, God forbid, 9 different generations. So this is a very relevant topic, and it's only going to intensify. It's only going to accelerate. So I think that's why it's very important that we find our footing now. All right, so that gives us a good basis of where we are with the generations. Let's keep moving forward. Let's look at the 2016 workplace. This is the current makeup. You'll notice that Generation Z is now inching into the workplace. And that's mostly in the form of internships. Again, this is a very ambitious bunch. A lot of them are having internships in high school even. But here's what's important about 2015 and 2016. This was really the first year that millennials now outnumber both Gen X and boomers in the workplace. That's why we had all those interesting dynamic and interesting words that came to your mind, right? Because they're challenging a lot of what's already been existing for how many years in the workplace. What's your best guess, and shout it out if you know the answer, what percentage of the workplace will be millennials and Generation Z for a little bit of by 2025? What percentage? Shout it out. 45? 75? I think that was Robin. I heard 75. She's all over this. So that's the correct answer, 75%. Cue the jaw drop, cue the eye roll. Go ahead. And sometimes I like to barricade the exits, too, before I show that stat, so no one goes running out of the room screaming for their lives. But imagine, think about your situation and the way you work. I bet just 5 years ago, it's drastically different, right, than how you work today. So fast forward 10 years, right, just a little bit under 10 years. Imagine how your work and your industry is going to change when 75% of it are digital natives that think differently and approach the world in a completely different way. There's going to be massive amounts of change. But don't panic. My name is Ryan. I'm your friend. I'm here to help, okay? All right. Give you a couple of millennial stats that can paint the picture, give you some context around this generation. 63% of millennials have a bachelor's degree, making them the most educated generation ever. Now, that doesn't say the most smartest generation. It simply says the most educated. So for my millennials in the room, those that are currently enrolled at a university, it's a very crowded talent pool. What are you doing to rise above? 71% of millennials are disengaged at work, the most of any generation. And I'm going to give you some specific tactics on how to gobble up and erode that statistic in your specific organizations. 58% of millennials expect to leave their jobs in 3 years or less. Now, that number says that they expect to leave in 3 years or less. Does anyone want to venture a guess what the average tenure of a millennial is currently? Did someone say 6 months? Oh, I'm sorry for that. 3 years? Yeah, it's 2 years is the going rate at this point. There's some new research now coming out that's saying it's as short as 16 months. The dynamic has changed, and as one of our panelists mentioned, it's costly, $25,000 to $30,000 to replace a millennial employee. Ouch, right? So again, I'm going to give you some statistics to hopefully to attack that. And then lastly, 70% of millennials across the globe might reject traditional business to work independently. So not only, if you're an organization that's looking to recruit top talent, not only are you having to compete against your competitors to pluck that ripe millennial talent, but you're now actually having to compete against the millennials' own ambition to be an entrepreneur. And as we've seen, it's easier than ever before to be an entrepreneur, isn't it? The barriers are lower than ever before. You can go to a Starbucks, launch a business, and market it to the world via social media before lunchtime. And think about this too. Entrepreneurship wasn't always sexy. There was a time where if you were an entrepreneur and you told someone you were an entrepreneur, someone would roll their eyes in the back of their head. They'd be saying, "That means you don't have the skills to get a corporate job." Right? That's true. It's now sexy to be an entrepreneur, and a lot of millennials have a side hustle while they're still at school. So this is something that we have to lean into, and I'll give you a specific tactic on how to attack that statistic as well. All right, I think this is really important to put some context around as well, is millennials and Generation Z are truly the first global generations. 50% of millennials want opportunities for international work assignments. And 58% of adults worldwide, ages 35 and above, agree that kids today have more in common with their global peers than they do with adults in their own country. So what does that mean? An 8-year-old here in Bakersfield, California, could have more in common with an 8-year-old in India than someone who's 65 in their own country. It's a global generation. We'll talk about how they became that way. I'm fortunate enough to I have a column for Inc.com, and the stuff that I write about that's mostly US-based, you can find the same content, same ideas in the Moscow Times. So we live now in a very connected world, and this generation grew up in a very connected world, and we'll talk specifically about that. All right, so we're going to have some fun with this now. We're going to talk about the evolution of the millennials, okay? We're going to take one millennial's story, and we're going to call this individual Millennial Mike, and his story starts in 1988. He was born. He was 1 in a million, literally. And we're going to fast forward to when things get a little interesting, and that is in the year 1996. Millennial Mike is infatuated with Nintendo, specifically Nintendo 64. Some of you are chuckling because this might be your son or daughter. And so gaming fundamentally has rewired this generation. This is a generation that grew up gaming. Gaming is exploding. 97% of youth today play computer or video games. It's no longer something weird that you do in the basement of your mom's house, right? Gaming is exploding. Wait and see. You'll see much more esports, which are gamified sports, on a lot of channels in the very near future. But here's why gaming is important. Here's the first takeaway. Millennials desire feedback, difference-making, and diverse teamwork. So let's tackle the first one. They desire feedback. Well, they grew up gaming, right? And what is gaming? Well, gaming is a constant feedback loop. You push a button, something happens. You choose this mission, something happens. And so you're in this environment where you're constantly receiving feedback. So that's an expectation they now pull into the workplace, and they expect constant feedback, Robin alluded to it earlier, and it's very true. Secondly, they want to be difference makers. That's why we play games. They immerse themselves in games to save the world, to have that epic win. They now pull that into the workplace. They want to have an impact on day one, right? Some of you probably felt this tension. And then lastly, they want diverse teamwork. Millennial Mike was able to jump on Xbox, put on a headset, and play along somebody in real time that was halfway around the globe. So again, this has helped shape the thinking of this generation that they're really boundaryless, right? So that's our first takeaway. Now let's fast forward to the year 2000. Millennial Mike is in middle school, and he hears about this thing called AOL. Thinks that sounds kind of cool. Him and his buddies go home after school. They jump online. About an hour later, they're able to create their username. Yep. Thank you, dial-up. And they begin chatting with friends, and they're leaning into technology and testing and figuring it out and pushing the envelope. Here's what we learned from this phase in Millennial Mike's life. I'm sorry, my clicker is losing a little bit of gas, I think. Maybe I forgot to work out this morning. Millennials number two, or takeaway number two, millennials approach differently how they learn, work, socialize, communicate, play because of technology. It's fundamentally rewired their brain. All right, now let's move forward to the year 2003. This is where things get really interesting. Millennial Mike is in high school, and he has access to Google. How many of you had access to Google while in high school? Throw your hand up. All straight A students, I imagine, yes? Can I get a head nod? No? Okay, so let's all play along. What if we had access to Google in high school? What if we all did that? What would we have done? Shout it out. Not gone to the library. What else?
I would have started Facebook.
You would have started Facebook. And with that kind of gumption and ambition, I know you would have. I like that. What else? Plagiarizing. Shopped. Someone said shop. I love that, of course. Yeah, we would have all gotten really good at cutting and pasting, right? Cut, paste, cut, paste. I asked this question about a month ago in another session with an organization. A gal in the front row, it was just a knee-jerk reaction. As soon as I asked that question, she jumped out of her seat and said, "I would have cheated better." And everyone slowly nodded, like that's what we were thinking, but no one said it. And I loved it too that she was in the front row and said that. It was brilliant. Yeah, so here's what's really important. Again, access to the internet, technology has shaped this generation. And the millennials are the first generation ever to not consider teachers or parents as the authority, but rather who or what do they consider the authority? Themselves, I heard someone say. The internet, right? You got the world's information at your fingertips, you better believe you're going to use it. So here's what we learned. Millennials consider the internet the authority, and they thus think and approach problems fundamentally different. Fundamentally. We'll move now to the year 2005. Millennial Mike is finally able to join Facebook. And I say finally because there was tons of buzz at the moment around the idea of Facebook. And Facebook started in 2004. It was college only. 2005, it opened up to high school. And so you better believe Millennial Mike jumped all over it, started a group, began connecting with other students that were about to attend his college, and he made friends, even found a roommate before he even set foot on college campus. So we're using it as a tool. Also in 2005, Millennial Mike, he's about to go to college, he's a senior. His parents decide to give him what? A cell phone. Decide to give him a cell phone. And for you parents in the room that gave your child a cell phone, it was for two reasons. For safety and logistics, right? But you immediately regretted that decision. Immediately when you received that first bill, didn't you? We're all chuckling because it's true. Why did you freak out when you got that bill? Texting, right? I heard a few of you say it, texting. Millennial Mike discovered texting, and that charges were skyrocketing. So here's what we learned from this phase in Millennial Mike's life. There it is. I'm just keeping you guys in suspense here. Millennials, takeaway number 4, are early adopters and seek out opportunities to innovate. When it came to social media, Google, instant messaging, texting, mobile devices, they're early. So they pull that now expectation in the workplace, and they're looking to innovate. They're going to push the boundaries. They're going to see how they can work smarter, systemize, or create systems, automate things. Let's move forward now to the year 2007. Millennial Mike is in college, and he is fortunate enough to have parents that buy him what? Iconic device. The iPhone. You bet. Now, the iPhone, first of all, I don't think we give the iPhone enough credit for how much it's just changed everything, right? It's changed the game. But for millennials, this thing was nirvana. They were already texting, right? And the iPhone introduced its first virtual keyboard. It introduced predictive text technology. It could learn new words. And the saving grace of the entire millennial generation, automatic spell check. How would we have survived without it? So it's changed the game, and I think really because of all those features I just rattled off, and with the millennials, the largest generation on the planet, I really think they moved the needle. And here in 2007, when the iPhone came out, was fundamental for all of us, all Americans in the room, each and every one of you. 2007 was the first year we sent and received more text messages than we did phone calls. Fundamentally changed our behavior. I'm going to have a little fun here, if I can. Raise your hand if the last communication you had was a phone call. You actually spoke to someone on the other end of a phone. Raise your hand if that was your last piece of communication. I see maybe 10 of you in a room of 500. Our behaviors have changed. I'm not going to even say this is necessarily a generational thing. We are all experiencing change, and I'm going to talk about that in a few. But all this technology is impacting the way we communicate, the way we work, the way we live. So here's the takeaway. Millennials' communication has and will continue to be shaped by technology. 2008, Millennial Mike is still in college, and he bumps into this thing called Twitter. He thinks, man, this looks like a shiny AOL. So he creates an account, starts using Twitter. And in the early stages, Twitter was really considered a microblog where people could just share thoughts and ideas. And what that opened Millennials Mike's eyes to the world of blogging. And so he began blogging, and he used Tumblr, which was a very millennial-friendly blogging platform. And he began sharing his thoughts, ideas, opinions, what have you. And now 50% of all bloggers today are millennials. And here's what we learned from this pivotal point in Millennial Mike's life. Millennials are contributors looking for an active role and an immediate impact. The internet has given them a global platform to have a voice and to contribute, and they've taken advantage of it. And they pull that into the workplace. On day one, they want to have an impact. On day one, they might send you an email with a list of all the things that are wrong with your organization, right? All right, 2009, Millennial Mike is a senior in college, and he's about to graduate. Who does that anymore in 4 years? So he's about to graduate. Before he gets a job, what's he have to do? Shout it out. Resume, network, all right answers, LinkedIn. I think before any of those things, before any of that, Millennial Mike has got to go to Facebook, and he's got to detag himself from all his spring break photos. That is priority number one, right? But we laugh at that because it's true, but we laugh at it because millennials had no idea. They were the first on Facebook, and they were using it just to hang out with friends and to connect and communicate. They had no idea employers were going to use it to vet them as their character or use that as their personal brand. So very interesting. I also want to say that it's really interesting now how behaviors are rippling up. I think it's really one of the first times, I think, in a long time, or perhaps ever, how quickly behaviors are rippling up the generations. All right, Facebook, I won't do this to this crowd because I like you and I'm your friend. But sometimes if I'm feeling ornery, I'll ask a crowd, raise your hand if you're on Facebook right now. The whole room pretty much raises their hand. And then I ask them, keep your hand raised if you've ever told yourself or someone else that you would never be on Facebook. And most of that room keeps their hand shamefully raised. So I think we're at a point in how turbulent things are that we need to be careful to be so judgmental or criticize some of these new forms of communication, because we might just be using that same communication in the very near future, especially as these millennials move into the workplace. So my point here, millennials are massively persuaded by their peers and value relationships and experiences over work. Millennial Mike, as he's getting ready to find a job, he's amassed large social networks, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and he's going to lean into those networks to crowdsource his life decisions. He's going to ask those networks, what book should I read? Where should I go eat? What movie should I see? What city should I go live in? And really last on that list is, where should I go work? Millennials still typically choose a city before they actually choose a job. Because again, they value relationships and experiences over work. So if you're trying to connect with this generation, leverage their peers. All right, moving forward. And keeping everyone in suspense. 2012. Millennial Mike is now settling in, or he's been in his career for 3 years, and he's got 3 different careers, right? Seems about right for millennials. Job hopping, seeing what's going on, what's out there. But here's the dynamics that are at play here. How many of you are familiar with Glassdoor, the website Glassdoor? Good, enough, a good portion of you. Glassdoor, for those that don't know, it's a website that houses employee reviews on their companies, what benefits those companies offer, salaries. It's created tremendous job market transparency. And so now millennials, you can't pull any wool over their eyes. They can actually see what's going on in other organizations. And layer on top of that Facebook and YouTube, they know exactly what they're missing in other organizations. And so now it's putting new accountability on organizations to make some really dynamic culture changes. So what we learned from this, millennials takeaway number 8 is they demand transparency from their leaders, their employers, and their brands. That's kind of been a theme that you've heard throughout the day, that they value authenticity. 2014, Millennial Mike is now settling in as a young professional, and technology continues to shape how he lives, works, and play. Specifically, we look at Netflix and Amazon. That's created an on-demand generation. I have an 8-month-old daughter, and she will not know a world where she can't hit a button and a drone will drop off a package within an hour. So that's going to reshape how she thinks about shopping, right? So I think there's lots of dynamics at play, especially when we talk about an on-demand generation. Snapchat. How many of you are on Snapchat? Be proud. Yeah, all right. I know where the student table is now. Snapchat. If you want to connect with this generation, you're trying to market this generation, you should be seriously considering Snapchat. A majority of millennials are using Snapchat. It's got the same momentum as a Facebook or Twitter. It's the fastest growing social network today. And you'd be kidding yourself if you think this emerging generations, as they come into the workplace and as they're fundamentally communicating different via Snapchat, that they're going to be okay communicating just via email. They're going to fundamentally challenge how we communicate in the workplace because they're already communicating in a much different way. Uber and Airbnb has created a love of the share economy for this generation. And then lastly, Slack. How many of you are familiar with the company and the tool Slack? Only a few of you. Slack is, Inc.com just rated Slack as their company of the year. It's one of the fastest growing tech companies in the last decade or two. It is, if we can get those slides back up, my AV team. Slack is one of the fastest growing technology companies out there. And what is Slack? It's an app messaging tool. So it's basically a hybrid of Twitter and email, if you will. And so why it's so powerful is this generation wants to collaborate. They want to use collaborative technologies to communicate, and they're flocking to Slack. And we'll talk a little bit about it later. But here's what else is really incredible about Slack. I think some of you are probably on your devices trying to figure out to download this right now, right? The number one goal for Slack, the organization and the tool, is to eradicate email. Can I get an amen? Right? So again, these technologies are shaping how this generation, how they communicate, how they approach work. And so they're going to continue to lean into these technologies. All right, and then lastly, in Millennial Mike's journey, 2016, he is now getting ready to step into his first management role. I got a couple of chuckles. Okay, yeah, because it's scary, I imagine, right? In fact, 30% of 21 to 32-year-olds have already achieved a management position. So the takeaway here, what I want to ask you is, before I ask you a question, is millennials' high-tech and hyper-social upbringing have made them disruption-prone leaders. How will millennials change your world? How will Millennial Mike, in this high-tech, hyper-social upbringing that he's had, how will that impact your industry? How is that going to impact how you work? especially as they begin making decisions in organizations. And I promise you, please hear me when I say this, I promise you, millennials are not trying to aggravate you on purpose. I promise. They have just a fundamentally different background, right? They've grown up, I mean, none of us have ever seen this before. So it has created a new breed of worker, a new breed of consumer. And so we have to start understanding it. And why I think it's so important to look at generations is that there's behaviors, so you can pinpoint it, understand it, begin predicting how do I adjust my leadership, my communication, my business, my brand. So the question is, will you be ready? When this generation begins stepping into the workplace into decision-making roles, will you be ready? What's going to happen? My gut says massive amounts of change. But don't panic. Again, my name is Ryan. I'm here to help, okay? So I'm going to give you some actionable strategies here in a few. But I know we camped out here a lot, but I hope it's really helpful. Again, you guys can have all these slides. But if you haven't heard anything else that I say so far, get this one thing. This is really important as well. Nintendo is to blame for everything. We now know. We now know. All right, so here's just a cheat sheet. Again, this is a tool that's also going to be on that link whenever it's back live. And again, you can just have that's everything we just talked about. So use this, and hopefully it'll impact your organization, your leadership. All right, let's talk a little bit about Generation Z. Let's just kind of touch the surface because they're still pretty young. We don't know a whole lot about them. 73% of Generation Z are connected within an hour or less of waking up. I think it's maybe when I walk over there that the clicker is. Over 50% of Generation Z say it's easier or more convenient to chat digitally. 77% of Generation Z rely on technology to help accomplish personal and professional goals. And lastly, 65% say people whom they work with would enable their work. So again, this is to just help you get some context around who this generation is. So let's look at what are the difference between millennials and Gen Z. So Generation Z, I believe, is going to be more pragmatic. They grew up in a very turbulent time, terrorism, war, recession. And they're looking at the millennials. They got a front row seat to the millennials and a lot of their shortcomings, and so they're going to adjust. The millennials are super optimistic and hopeful, like Robin mentioned, but I think this generation will be much more realistic and pragmatic. Oh, before I go there, more individualistic. Generation Z grew up in a world that was connected. Their parents were posting pictures of their sonogram before they were even born. So a lot of them have a digital footprint before they're even in this world. And so a lot of them are going to look to peel away and begin developing their own individualism or individualistic traits, because to them it seems like everyone's done everything and they've already kind of built their social footprint on the web. So we expect them to find more individual ways to express themselves. More face-to-face. This might surprise many of you. But again, Generation Z had a front row seat into what many would say is perhaps the Achilles heel of millennials, which is lack of interpersonal skills and the ability to communicate face-to-face. So I think they're going to counterbalance that. They're going to focus on that. But also look at the tools they're using. Snapchat, FaceTime, Google Plus Hangouts, Skype. They're actually communicating face-to-face. Where it might not be in person, it's virtual, and they're using motion, sound, and visual to communicate. So I see a resurgence in the face-to-face communication. I think we can all be excited about that. More global. As more of the world comes online, it's going to shrink geographies. The world will become flatter, smaller, essentially. And so, of course, this generation is going to think more boundaryless than the millennials. They're going to have global thought process and global relatability and global communication skills. They're going to be less focused. There's more clamoring for their attention than ever before. They have 10-second Snapchats. They have 6-second Vines. They're consuming this information on a rapid pace, so we anticipate they'll be less focused than millennials. They'll be less parented. Generation X are the folks that are raising this generation, Generation Z for the most part. And Generation X is very aware of the stigma and perhaps the negativity surrounding that everyone gets a trophy parenting style that the millennials had from the baby boomers. So they're gonna actually consider themselves a coach versus a friend when it comes to parenting. And then they're going to be less educated. You think about Generation Z, actually statistics show that they're not looking to pursue higher education as much as the millennials were at the same age. And why would they when there's so many alternatives out there, right? So they're constantly figuring this. We heard it from Chris, too, when you hear about the student loan debt. So they're evaluating these things in their head. So I would say they might be less formally educated because they're going to leverage the web to learn some things and more on the fly in the workplace as well. And then lastly, they may be less noticed. Generation X, Chris was shouting it out. He was trying to give you guys some love. Why? Because you were overshadowed by the large baby boom generation. So that very well could happen to Generation Z as well, being overshadowed from the largest generation on the planet, the millennials. All right, this is the last slide before we dig into our next topic and look at, before I start giving you some strategies. This is really important, though. Millennials are a critical mass of change agents. What is critical mass? If you have a scale and you finally have enough of something that tips that scale, that's critical mass. Okay? And why are millennials critical mass? Because they're the largest generation on the planet. Where they go, so goes change. Where they go, so goes disruption. Social media is a good example. It was created by a millennial, aka Mark Zuckerberg for the most part. It was adopted by millennials, and now it's gone mainstreamed because of millennials. And people always ask me, well, Ryan, why is today different? There's always been generational differences when they come into the workplace. Boomers, when you came into the workplace, massive amounts of change because of your sheer size, right? Here's why today's different, though, and here's why we've got to find our footing. 2 reasons why today's different. Technology and the internet. Technology and the internet have changed the game. It's changed how we live and work, hasn't it? It's changed the game. And so you have those 2 items, and you couple it with the largest generation on the planet, and that's the recipe for massive, massive disruption. We're living in exponential times. I want to tell you a little bit about what are these, and what does it look like to live in an exponential time. And I want to do that with a question. So I'm going to ask you, and shout out whatever comes to your mind. Name an invention that's happened in the past, and we can go back as far as fire if you guys want. So just shout out an invention that's happened in the past. The wheel, electricity, the printing press, airplanes, the light bulb. Yeah. What else? Computers. I think we're almost there. I think we have 2 left. Two other, no. We could basically name anything in this room. Light bulbs, stage, monitors, TVs, right? It's incredible how far we've come. But here's what's important. Here's why today's different. All those inventions that I heard and that I repeated are all inventions that have impacted our physical world. So that has limited how much growth they have. It's limited how fast other people can adopt it, right? Well, today's inventions are happening in the cloud, a lot of them. They're happening in cyberspace, in the digital world. So that's giving it power to grow exponentially. So let me give you a good example, or a couple of examples. If Facebook, it was really an invention that happened in the cloud, right? If Facebook was a country, where would it rank based on population in the world? I think I heard biggest, yes. It would be number 1 based on population. 1.5 billion people use Facebook. And in August of last year, Facebook, for the first time ever, reached a pretty astonishing statistic, and that was 1 billion people used Facebook in a single day. 1 billion people use Facebook in a single day. That could not have happened in any other time in history where that many people can use a single tool. And guess what? Facebook started in 2004. It's the biggest country based on population on the planet. Exponential times that we live in. The mobile device that some of you clearly are playing Candy Crush on right now. Yeah, I see you. This mobile device, again, we don't give enough credit. This mobile device is all of you that have them in your hand, your purse, your pocket, this device is 100,000 times smaller and several billion, with a B, several billion times more powerful than a computer was in the early 70s. We carry this around with us. Pretty unbelievable, right? And if you took this device and you gave it to a child in a developing country, they would instantly have access to more information than the President of the United States did just 15 years ago. Exponential times that we're living in. A couple more examples to further melt your minds. What's the largest taxi service on the planet today? Uber. And how many does Uber doesn't own any what? Taxis, cars, vehicles. Yeah. And by the way, Uber is the largest taxi service on the planet, and they'll be celebrating their 7th birthday this year. What's the largest hotel service on the planet? Airbnb. The second largest hotel service is Marriott. They have 1 million rooms available around the world. Marriott's number 2 with 1 million rooms. They've been around for over 55 years. Airbnb has been around 8 years and has 2 million rooms. Exponential times that we live in. And oh, by the way, they don't own a single room, right? So we live in exponential times. So I say all that because it's really important that we understand that it's not just generational. This isn't just a millennial thing. All of us are living through a fundamental culture shifts that's changing everything. And so we have to be aware of it. And so yes, the millennials are demanding a lot of change from us and our organizations, but more importantly, in a bigger picture, is the exponential times that we now live in are forcing us to change. If we don't get smart, if we don't get agile, we'll be passed at the speed of Uber, right? Really important. And so that's why I think it's important, again, to look at millennials, because they're a signpost of all this change. They give us some behavior behind some of this change. And so that's why I think there's tremendous value to understand them and to even poke fun at them a little bit, right? Okay, that was a lot. I'll take a deep breath now, all right? But I knew you guys could handle it, okay? All right, so now let's talk a little bit about some of the generational differences, and then I'll get into those 4 strategies to help. So we're going to look at 4 generations that are in the workplace, and we're going to look at their communication preferences. Robin touched on a lot of this as well, so I'll step through it a little bit quicker. When it comes to communication, the builders look for formal, respectful. Boomers want formal, direct. Gen X want informal, flexible. And millennials want informal, authentic. Their view of communication: builders, phone, email; boomers, email, text; Gen X, email, text, Facebook; millennials, text, Instagram, Tumblr, Snapchat. Basically anything that has nothing to do with face-to-face communication, right? They're going to flee from those situations. And then lastly, their attitude when it comes to communication. Builders need background info and details. Boomers want to keep it professional. Gen X need options and 0 meetings. And millennials want brevity, real time, and quick responses. And we're going to talk specifically about that last one here in a minute. So we're going to do the same exercise, but we're going to look at work now. Each generation has a different perspective when it comes to work. Builders view it as a responsibility. Boomers a place, Gen X a means to an end, millennials a vehicle. Their view of it: builders, lifers; boomers are defined by their work. Gen X a tool, millennials fulfilling. They're looking for meaningful work. And then lastly, their attitude: builders, they'll tell you you're lucky to have a job, right? Boomers will tell you loyalty is rewarded. Gen X, work hard, play hard, looking for that work-life balance. And millennials want to work smart. They're going to lean into their high-tech background to shorten the time frames to get work done faster. And then the last segment we're going to look at here is the leadership. Builders want to endure it, just hanging in there, right? Boomers want to respect it. Gen X want to ignore it. Gen X, very entrepreneurial, coming into the workplace. And then millennials want to choose it. I'm just going to hit pause right there. Millennials grew up in an age of customization. They could customize the shoes they wore, the t-shirts they wore, to the cars they would eventually not drive. And so they pull that into the workplace. They're looking to customize. They want some of that customization in their own hands. And then their view of it, when it comes to leadership: builders want to honor it, boomers respect, Gen X autonomy, millennials equals. If you ask millennials who their best friends are, what would be the top response? I heard it. Yep, parents. It's not Siri or their friends or themselves, right? Their best friend is their parents. So boomers, I think that's noble. You raise a generation that wants to hang out with you. But they pull that now into the workplace. So they look at some of their leaders as equals, and they want to be friends. And that's why you see a lot of the informality emerging as well. And then lastly, when it comes to leadership, and Robin kind of touched on this as well: builders, no news is good news. Boomers, feedback once per year. Gen X, routine check-ins. And millennials want that constant feedback from their leaders. All right, so I want to give you 4 elements now. I gave you some really good foundational of what it looks like in the 21st century when it comes to generations, specifically millennials. So I'm going to give you some actionable tips to move forward with. And in each one of these segments, I'm going to give you some context. I'm going to give you a stat. I'm going to give you some examples, and I'll give you a tip. And the first element that will engage millennials is innovation. 78% of millennials were strongly influenced by how innovative a company was when deciding if they wanted to work there. And secondly, 66% of millennials work in organizations that actively encourage/reward its people for innovative ideas. They're looking for innovation. So a couple examples of who's doing this well. LinkedIn. LinkedIn has and by the way, a lot of this is perhaps outside of some of the industries that you're all associated with, and that's on purpose, right? If I told you stuff that a lot of your competitors were doing, you just become copycats, right? So this stuff's going to be hopefully different and outside your space to really get the gears turning. But what does LinkedIn do? They have a program where any employee in the organization can submit an idea. That could be an idea about a new product or service, about a new system or process, and they do that every quarter. And every quarter they choose a few ideas, and whoever submitted those ideas then gets the power, I guess the authority to go execute those ideas. They get to cut red tape and try to figure out how to do the idea. So it's a great, strong example of how innovation and how they're leveraging an organization where ideas truly can now come from anywhere. And the second example is a company called ADP, Automatic Data Processing. I heard a VP talk about this specific story on a stage from a change management conference. So brilliant. It's a great fit for what we talk about here. They are a comprehensive payroll service company. They were started in, I believe, 1949, I believe. They have 60,000 employees. They've always been considered a conservative company. But they knew, okay, we live in exponential times. How do we reinvigorate our company? If we were to rebuild our organization today in 2016, in exponential times, in the digital age that we live in, what would our business look like? So they started what they call an innovation lab 15 miles from their headquarters. And they began to staff it differently. They began hiring millennials. They began changing the physical workspace and how people work and collaborate. And they began to just rethink everything, the processes, systems they use. And if you asked ADP if it was a success, they would tell you with a resounding yes. Why? Because it's created more open collaboration. It's fostered more creativity. And most importantly for ADP is they're able now to come to market faster with new products and services. So they're now leveraging what they created in that innovation lab, and they're trying to have that become the culture throughout the entire organization. So my strategy, my tip here when it comes to innovation is to infuse entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is this idea of acting like an entrepreneur within a larger organization. Right? We saw that millennials want to be entrepreneurs. They like that idea. So how can you leverage them inside your organization to perhaps execute on new projects or rethink how things have always been done? And the bottom line here is the permission and power to innovate will engage millennials. Number two is flexibility. 73% of millennials expect to be able to modify and customize their work computer. And get this, 63% will go around IT to find the solutions they need. So if you don't give it to them, they're going to find ways to do it. They are a resourceful bunch. Millennial Mike had access to Google in high school, remember. 69% of millennials believe office attendance is unnecessary on a regular basis. Many of my audiences say that's low. They think that's really low. Perhaps it is. So we're talking about flexibility. So a couple of good examples here. Number one is Deloitte. Deloitte has a program that they call, it's called the Mass Career Customization. And they allow their new hires to basically choose the work that they do. I like to think of it as a choose your own adventure book. Remember those? It's a choose your own adventure book when it comes to how, where, when, and what you work on. So powerful example on how to engage this generation when it comes to flexibility. PricewaterhouseCoopers, this year, 2016, they are going to launch what they call the Loan Paydown Program. Millennials have the largest student debt of any generation. Chris told us that might not be as alarming as we thought, but they still have a lot of debt compared to any other generation. And so PricewaterhouseCoopers is leaning into that, and they're going to offer employees that have been with the company between 1 to 7 years, which is about 50% of their organization, and they're going to offer them $1,200 every year to contribute towards their debt. So it's a good, strong example of how they're leveraging flexibility. They're trying to rethink some of their existing benefits, compensation, whatever it may be, to engage this generation. So my example here is to embrace output versus input. Let me kind of set the stage on this a little bit. Raise your hand if you've ever checked your work email in bed in the morning or evening, outside of work. Raise your hand. That's probably 80% of the room. How many of you ever checked email on vacation? That seems like everyone. You all are troubled people. Might have to have a workaholic session next year or something. So we just proved what I'm about to go into, and that work doesn't have to happen in a place anymore. Work has shifted from a place to a space. From a place to a space. It wasn't too long ago that you had to get into a car and drive to a building, and inside that building is where work happened, right? And then you left and you went home and you didn't have the capacity to work anymore. Wouldn't that have been nice today? So no longer does work happen in a place, and Robin alluded to this as well. But we can't, if we all buy into that, and I think we all just proved it, we can't manage based on input, basis butts and seats, time at desks, the input of time, or tenure, if you will. It's inefficient to manage via input. We have to manage on output, the results, the outcome. And so as leaders, here's the bottom line. We've got to provide clear, results-driven direction to engage millennials. If they know exactly what's expected of them, then let them choose, right, to how they would get that work done, whether that be the tools or the time that it takes to do that. And in certain regards, you have to have a firm time frame, right, in some industries and for some organizations, so that's understandable. But if that's the case, communicate the why. You need to communicate to them why this has to be done at a certain time. All right, number 3 is feedback. This is there's managers pulling out their hair every day across the country when it comes to feedback and delivering it to millennials. 42% of millennials want feedback every week, and that's twice the percentage of every other generation. And 50% is how much more often millennials want feedback over other employees. Remember Millennial Mike? Gaming, it created a constant feedback loop. So he's craving that feedback. So a couple examples. One is a company called Bunny Inc. They've got about 50 employees. They're an online professional services company. And they deliver employee surveys via a tool called Nico, N-I-K-O, Nico. And it mirrors a lot of millennial social behaviors, whether that be swiping left for no or right to yes, or using a mobile device to say, out of 1 out of 10, how satisfied are you with the company, with leadership, with the cleanliness of the workspace? And so they've seen tremendous results in how engaged and how much surveys they get back internally from their employees using this new tool. So it's a strong example in how we can leverage technology and mirror some of the social behaviors of millennials to get more feedback. And that's kind of an internal example. The next example is Charity Water. Charity Water delivers clean water to places around the world that need it. And what Clarity Water does is they actually communicate internally via Slack. Remember that app that I told you about earlier? That's one of the fastest growing tech companies we've seen in a while. They communicate via Slack. So no longer do they use email. It's all using Slack. And millennials are flocking to it because, again, we're thinking about feedback here, is that no longer does a millennial have to sit down and send an email to their manager and then hope, cross their fingers and wait till they get a response or feedback on that project. They can now use Slack and post the feedback they're looking for or the help that they need. And then peers, colleagues, other managers can chime in, give them the feedback they need, and then they're able to be that much more productive. So it's making organizations more productive, and it's very native for millennials. So powerful, powerful tool. And the last example here, probably the most groundbreaking, is GE. Just recently, last year, GE announced that they're going to do away with their 30-year-long annual review process. They've scrapped it. And in its place, they've created an app where they can get mobile, fast, and frequent feedback. And if you ask the head of HR why they did that, they tell you they're considering the young professionals, the millennials in their organization, and the need they have for feedback. Hopefully those get the gears turning when it comes to feedback. And my tip here is to practice frequent feedback. I think if we're honest with ourselves and we think about feedback, we kind of get a cold chill down our spine, right? Feedback is normally semi-annually, annually, scheduled time, one-on-one, checking boxes. It's not a good experience for both parties. But we now live in an age where feedback can happen on the fly. It can happen in real time. Slack is a good example. I recently worked with a gentleman. I taught this, and he came up to me after the presentation and said, "Hey, I'm using, this. Can I tell you how I'm doing?" I said, "Sure, absolutely." He said, "I've got a young team of millennials, and at the end of each day, before I turn on my car, I sit in my car and I'll text my millennials. I'll give them correction or direction, not fluffy praise or random, participation ribbons via emojis. That's not what he does. Correction or direction." And he said, "Ryan, every time I do that, I'm always shocked at the end of the day how many millennials are back online and they're executing against that correction or feedback I gave them." So I think we have a dated view when it comes to feedback. So I think we need to take a step back, reevaluate it, and how can you start delivering feedback, one, to satisfy this need for millennials, but two, to make them more productive. So the bottom line here is to favor frequent feedback to engage millennials. And then the last strategy I want to talk about is development. The number one reason millennials leave an organization is the lack of career opportunity. And 71% of millennials likely to leave a company within 2 years believe their leadership skills are not being fully developed. So a couple examples of who's doing development well. Babson College has what they call the reversing the classroom. It's somewhat, I guess, is not quite of reversing the classroom. But every few weeks, every semester, they allow the students to teach the class. They allow the students to, they understand that the students have a certain skill set, certain knowledge base that a professor might not have. So they're allowing the students to teach the class things on, how to build an app or the state of the food truck industry, something relevant that the millennials might be interested in. So it gives those millennials teaching the class great development opportunities about communication skills, research. And then it equips the audience with a new set of perhaps relevant information that they could use to further their development. And then the other example is Zappos, our favorite shoe retailer, right? They actually do two things really well. Number one, they offer all of the relevant mentorship and training needed for any employee across the country or across their organization to move into a senior manager role within 5 to 7 years. Now you think 5 to 7 years, that seems like an eternity for millennials, and yes, you're probably right. But what they do is they actually incentivize them every 6 months. They give them opportunities to learn new skills, and if they do that, they can level up, get certified in a certain skill set, and they receive an automatic pay bump, or they might actually move into a different title or role. And so they're incentivizing them all along the way to keep them engaged, to keep them developing, and it's a tremendous value add for their employees and for Zappos as well. All right, so the last strategy I'm going to tell you about is reverse mentoring. How many of you have heard about reverse mentoring? A few of you, okay. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's when you find someone that's more junior than you and you ask them to mentor you. It really kind of got its start with Jack Welch at GE. He found so much benefit in this reverse mentoring role, he mandated that 500 of the folks on his team begin engaging in reverse mentoring. And it's so popular now that HP, Cisco, GE, Coca-Cola have structured reverse mentoring programs. And here's why it works. Millennials have been reverse mentoring from a very early age. They were the household CTO, right? They were helping mom and dad to figure out what Facebook was and how to use their mobile device or a computer. So they're very skilled. It's very natural for them to engage in this type of relationship. But I want to stress to you, if you want to engage in this, go beyond technology or social media and ask a millennial to teach you about leadership. I think you'll get all kinds of perspective. Of course, you've got more experience in that regard, but I think you'll learn a lot about what they appreciate leadership is. And the last thing I think, too, what makes it really powerful, this reverse mentoring, is that by default, you are modeling what it looks like to have strong communication skills. And that is something that this generation desperately needs. So you can model what a firm handshake looks like, what eyeball to eyeball, face-to-face communication looks like, the value of learning from other people. So I think that's truly the bonus here, right? The hidden gem in this. And so bottom line, it creates opportunities for millennials to develop their communication skills. So something to consider. All right, as we kind of wrap these up, I want to give you a quick example of a leader that's doing this very well. This comes from Jim Tomsula. We got any 49ers fans in the house? Boo, no one. So Jim Tomsula, this is not an example of how to take a team to the Super Bowl or how to not get fired as an NFL coach, okay? This is not that example. But it's a good example. It'll get the gears turning on how they're leveraging this. So Jim Tomsula, he was the head coach of the 49ers last year, and he was asked at the beginning of the season, what do you think about social media? He said, I hate it, I don't get it, I don't understand it, why bother? It didn't take Jim very long to change his tune because when you have an average age of a team of 25.2 years old, you need to understand social media. This is how they communicate. So he began to say, okay, I need to evolve my leadership if I'm going to engage with these millennials. So here's what he did. Number one, he used innovation. They switched to digital reminders. They used to still pin up paper with schedule and reminders on it. They did away with that because every millennial has a mobile device, so they've gone with digital reminders. Number two, flexibility. They went to shorter meetings. They used to have 2-hour meetings. You can't hold a millennial's attention for 2 hours. So they cut that to 30 minutes. They're using more interactivity and visuals in their meetings. And then lastly, he's using development. He's using reverse mentoring. Jim had a standing meeting with players, and he would have them teach them about technology and what they were thinking about career-wise and leadership. It was a standing meeting. So a great example of how, yes, we need to start rethinking our leadership. My message is not we have to change to cater to the millennials. That is not my message. My message is we need to adjust and be adaptive so that we can lead, run our businesses, and communicate like it's 2016. We need to be 21st century ready if we're going to thrive in the future. That's my message. All right, so in the interest of time, no questions, but please email me if you have your questions. I'm going to wrap things up with a quick story on how to effectively manage change. I think you guys will really enjoy. Hopefully, my website is still up at some point. A lot of good stuff on there, but at some point, at the end of the day, I'll have it back up so you guys can go there to get all these slides. And then lastly, for those that want extra credit, jot this down as well. I'm a millennial, so I'm looking for some feedback here, okay? So if you go to this link, ryan-jenkins.com/survey, there will be a survey there, easy, 7 questions, just interested in some of your feedback. And if you do that as a bonus, one of the questions I always get after these sessions is, how do we start building or training millennials to be effective and ready 21st century leaders? They still have a long ways to go when it comes to communications. How do you stamp out or overcome the sense of entitlement? Those are stuff that we're working on to try to help organizations. So more to come on that. But a good starting point, and we'll send it if you do the survey, is our latest book, which is 18 Next Generation Statistics to help shape your millennial training and future-proof your organization. So as a bonus, we'll get that to you if you complete that survey. I want to wrap up our time with a quick story. I think everything that we talked about today, the underbelly of it all is change. And as humans, we hate change. We resist change. But the funny thing is change is no respecter of person. And no, I'm not checking my Instagram feed. I'm actually going to pull up the story that I'm about to share. Change. So it's always coming. It's always going to hit us. It's like the waves of the ocean. It's constant and relentless. So this story is called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters by Portia Nelson. And in it are the 5 steps on how you manage change effectively. Okay? I think you guys will enjoy this. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Phase 1 of change is ignorance. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Phase 2 of change is self-deception. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit, but my eyes are open. I hope after today, your eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Phase 3 of change is surrender. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Phase 4 of change is adjustment. And finally, chapter 5, I walk down another street. Phase 5 of change is freedom. So after our time today, It's truly, 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 truly my hope for you is that you find your new street and you choose to walk boldly down it. Thanks for having me.